Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's about 2 or 3 minutes into the afternoon, so I can say good afternoon. I'm going to be pretty brief in my opening comments because we have a broad and deep topic to cover in a short hour. I'm Andy Fish. I'm Executive Director of AdvaMedDiagnostics. AdvaMedDx is the trade association representing the manufacturers of advanced diagnostic tests, both in the U.S. and worldwide. We're very pleased to put on this briefing in collaboration with LUNGevity, and I will defer to our colleague Andrea to introduce LUNGevity a little further in a moment. But we put together these briefings from time to time. I know we have some repeat guests. Thank you for being with us today. The topic that we've picked today is advanced diagnostics role in precision medicine, which of course is a broad topic. But as we think about the issue, first of all, we start with the premise that diagnostic tests are fundamental to precision medicine. We'll talk a little more in a few minutes about sort of the definition here, but we're talking essentially about tests that look for specific proteins or genetic sequences in your body or in your cancer cells, for example, that enable much more targeted understanding of disease and subsequent follow-up therapy and so forth. And if we start with the premise that diagnostic tests are a fundamental piece of precision medicine, then we quickly get to the idea that there's kind of a framework of issues that are all critical to ensuring that this area of medicine advances as quickly as possible. And it starts with technology innovation, both discovery from a biomarker standpoint as well as the development of tests to leverage that life sciences research. And then we look at the regulatory arena, and then subsequently the payment arena, which is challenging, and then more broadly at patient access. And all of these areas overlap, of course. Doing the right thing in one area means often making sure you're doing the right thing in another area. And that's really what we want to talk today about, is sort of what are the challenges, what are the linkages among all these things, and fundamentally share with you some of the takeaways about what can be done to best advance this field for the benefit of patients. The pace of change and discovery and innovation here is just tremendous. And it's really up to all of us as either advocates or as policymakers to ensure that we're doing the right things to keep this field advancing. So that's really the framework in which we're talking about today. So I'm going to introduce our panelists just briefly. Their bios are in your packet, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time with that. We really appreciate them being with us here today. So just simply in the order in which they're seated to my left, Andrea Ferris is President and CEO of LUNGevity Foundation, and Joydeep Goswami is, I was just checking to make sure you were actually in that seat, is President of Clinical Next Generation Sequencing and Oncology with Thermo Fisher Scientific, one of our member companies. And Mark Stewart is Senior Science, I'm going to go Paul. I had a different list than the seats. Paul Rudensky is partner with McDermott, Will & Emery. And Mark Stewart is Senior Science Policy Analyst with Friends of Cancer Research. So without any further ado, I'd like to ask each of you in the same order to just talk a little more about your organization, about the key work that you're doing, a little more background on yourselves if you'd like. Just take a few minutes, and then we'll get into some broader questions about what precision medicine really means, and we'll go from there into some of these other topics that I just teed up.
Thanks, Andy. So I'm Andrea Ferris. I'm the President and CEO of LUNGevity Foundation, and I'd like to thank AdvaMedDx for partnering with us on this briefing. So LUNGevity, we represent lung cancer patients. That's 226,000 who are diagnosed each year, as well as the 400,000 Americans living with lung cancer each year. As Andy had alluded to, the pace with which the science has accelerated has just been tremendous, and particularly for our population, which, simply 8 years ago, there really was not a lot of progress or hope, and now it's at the forefront of precision medicine, it's at the forefront of immunotherapy, and it's really helping to drive the change, and the science is evolving so rapidly, which is fantastic for patients, but the regulatory environment, the reimbursement environment, perhaps isn't caught up to where the science is, and I think they all need to be aligned to truly benefit the patients. And part of the reason that we at LUNGevity felt that this was such an important briefing to have and to hold is that there's been so much attention on precision medicine, and there should be. It's a really phenomenal thing. But you can't access the precision medicine and the therapeutics without the diagnostics. You can't benefit from the right therapy at the right time and the right dose if you don't know which therapy to be on. And for us and for the patient community that we represent, the diagnostic element has been so overlooked, and there really are some very fundamental issues that we need to deal with, and we need to draw to conclusion on how it is reimbursed, how it's regulated, how new diagnostics come to market in a really quick way to keep up with the pace of progress that can benefit the patients, as well as how patients access that testing. So those are all the things that we're looking forward to discussing with you today, and hope that you learn from it, as well as recognize that we'll probably be knocking on your doors to follow up on some of these issues. But just recognize as well that it really is transforming how patients are living with this disease and the progress that we can make. So thank you, and thank you, Andy, for partnering with us on this.
Great, thanks, Andrea. Joydeep?
Good afternoon. I'm Joydeep Goswami. I run the Clinical Next-Gen Sequencing and Oncology Division at Thermo Fisher. Specifically, our division is focused on using next-gen sequencing, NGS, in terms of developing new cancer diagnostics and tools and technologies that can advance the stratification of a tumor to guide the right drug that can be provided to a patient. So we focus a lot more on creating the instruments and then the reagents and the chemistries that can drive the detection of tumors accurately and with much more sensitivity, to be then, these technologies to then be democratized and be available to any lab that has a CLIA/CAP certification. So they can either develop their own test based on our products, or as was recently approved by the FDA, we had our first NGS companion diagnostic for multiple drugs and multiple tumor indications for lung cancer approved as the AdvaMedDx target test. And so our goal, again, as I said, is to democratize the availability of these technologies, whether it's solid tumor profiling, liquid biopsies, or immune profiling of the tumor niche, to be able to understand how the immune system of the body is reacting to a particular cancer. Again, all these three things drive treatment of the cancer as appropriate for that particular tumor and that particular patient. I think I'd reinforce what Andrea just said. We have the technology piece covered, and we're driving towards making these tests ever more sensitive, ever more easy to conduct. And I do think from where we sit, the technology is very far ahead of two other challenges that this field is facing. So one challenge is very clearly awareness, and the fact that very few patients, and unfortunately a relatively small percentage of doctors, are aware of the power that these advances in the field of technology can bring to their patients and their choice of treatment first time right. The second problem is one of reimbursement, and it's actually interesting that while more drugs are being reimbursed at rates which are exceeding hundreds of thousands of dollars for a course of therapy, all these drugs are dependent on understanding the true nature of the tumor, the mutational profile, the molecular profile of the tumor. That's impossible to do without these new technologies and tests that are coming out. And yet these very tests are being reimbursed at a level that it doesn't make sense for labs to actually offer these tests to patients. So I do think that's a challenge, and something that this panel hopefully should address, and hopefully that'll engender some questions on your end.
Great. Thanks, Paul.
Sure. Good afternoon. I'm Paul Rudensky. I'm with McDermott, Millen Emery, and also our firm's consulting practice, McDermott Plus. I'm a doc by training. I trained in internal medicine and finished my training about 35 years ago. And it, to me, is amazing what we are able to do with a better understanding and a molecular understanding of disease. When I was in training, if you were treating someone with leukemia, the real questions that you had were whether or not it was a B cell or a T cell leukemia, and that was done by looking at cell surface markers. But it's clear that we can do a much better job if we understand more about the molecular basis of disease. That said, the science is advancing very quickly, but unfortunately the tools that we have on the regulatory side and the reimbursement side tend to be somewhat clunky and not necessarily created for what we're currently asking them to do. So for example, on the reimbursement side, when some of the first molecular markers came up a number of years ago, we'd have payers who would say, well, just show me 2 randomized controlled trials and with appropriate survival endpoints. And we'd say, but wait a minute, if we're talking about early stage breast cancer or prostate cancer, start to map out what that study is going to look like, and you're not going to get an answer for 20 years. And so if no one's going to cover that test during that 20-year time period, then it's not going to develop. And so needed to figure out ways of getting new tools to look at diagnostics and not to simply have a knee-jerk response about thinking about the diagnostic the same as you might from a therapeutic perspective. Similarly, from a payment perspective, the clinical laboratory fee schedule that Medicare has had is a creature from 1984. We didn't have these tests in 1984, as I was just mentioning. And so trying to come up with rates when you have a fee schedule that's really anchored up saying, tell me what you're like from 1984, it doesn't work. And so had to work about trying to think about a different way and a different approach to doing that. Similarly, on the regulatory side, FDA historically thinks about a kit that's looking at an analyte and how you get the information for that. Many of the issues that we're talking about here are multidimensional. They're really looking at a number of different factors, but more importantly, how those factors work in concert. One of the reasons why finding a silver bullet in cancer was always elusive is because people were thinking about a particular treatment targeting a single pathway. Body doesn't work like that. The body works with multiple pathways that work in an interactive method. That's part of the beauty of what we're now seeing and enabled by precision medicine. FDA is coming to the fore. There's no question that some of the original discussions we had with them in 2006 about these kinds of tests and the discussions that are had today with the agency are dramatically different. But again, somewhat clunky and not really diagnostic focused tools in simply thinking about the same kind of rules for therapeutic devices as you have for diagnostics, many of which are single laboratory types of services at this point because it takes a while to get them to be kind of in a democratized way that Joydeep was discussing. So all of these are exciting areas and areas where there's a lot, not only innovation in the science, but innovation in the regulatory and reimbursement science, but a lot more still to do.
Great. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks Andrea and Andy for having us be a part of this conversation. My name is Mark Stewart. I'm a Senior Science Policy Analyst at Friends of Cancer Research. And for over the past 20 plus years, Friends of Cancer Research has really been instrumental in the creation and implementation of policies that ensure patients receive the safest and most effective treatments as quickly as possible. And one of the ways we're able to do this is by developing multi-stakeholder groups that contain the right experts, the right people to really push innovative ideas forward. An example of that is we've been fortunate over the past 6 years to have an incredible partnership with Alexandria Real Estate Equities, and we've been hosting a series of forums called the Blueprint for Breakthrough Forums, focused on diagnostic drug developments, and we've been really thinking about these issues in depth for the past 6 years and helping guide FDA and regulatory policy to be able to capture many of the innovations that are currently happening. We've pushed for regulatory pathways that ensure patients have access to many of these innovative therapies, and one of those is breakthrough therapy designations. And if you look back over the past several years at drugs that have been receiving this designation, many of them are targeted therapies. And so to be able to harness precision medicine, the key word there is precision. And so you need diagnostic tests that are available to patients that are able to accurately identify the mutation and direct their therapies. And so we actually just hosted our 6th Blueprint for Breakthrough Forum back in September. And prior to that meeting, over a 4-month course, we had a group of multi-stakeholders, experts within this field, both from patient advocacy, from the diagnostic companies and drug sponsors, and we challenged them to identify key priority areas that are hurdles now or will be hurdles moving forward. And I think it kind of echoes many of what we've already heard on this panel so far. And so we came out of that meeting with kind of 2 key priority areas, and one was ensuring that all diagnostic tests that are available to patients, whether it's FDA approved or a lab developed test, should meet some minimum standards to ensure that there's a level playing field, that they're all comparable, that physicians can be confident that when they send a biopsy off to a diagnostic test, that the results that they are getting are accurate and right. And then second, giving the quick and rapid pace of innovation was to ensure that a regulatory framework was in place that could ensure that the tests that are available to patients include this information. And I think one example of this is next-gen sequencing. And within the past year or so, we've had 3 next-gen sequencing platforms approved in oncology, and OncoMindDx is one of them. And I think these tests are designed to kind of be a one-stop shop in the sense that they're able to interrogate thousands and millions of DNA molecules to pinpoint which mutations a patient has and then direct them to a multitude of therapies, versus what we previously had was a diagnostic that tested for one molecule that paired to one drug. And so I think that paradigm shift is occurring now. But in order for a test like OncoMindDx to stay up to date, there needs to be a pathway to ensure that the modifications to these tests can happen at a rapid pace. So there's not this 180-day lag from a patient who might happen to be getting a test in that 180-day period, might not be benefiting from the latest information that's currently out there. And FDA, I think, recognizes the need for innovation in this space. They've released 2 draft guidances so far on next-gen sequencing, but I think there's more that can and should be done in this area.
Great, thanks, Mark. So maybe just to quickly set the stage so we're all in the same place when it comes to defining precision medicine. So there's personalized medicine is what we're talking about, but over time there's been a reaction, I think, in the field of medicine's always been personalized, or it should be. So precision medicine has been gradually adopted as a maybe a little better term of art, basically referring to, again, as several of us have already alluded to, the idea that you can stratify previously broad patient populations that might be characterized by saying, having breast cancer, to now stratify that population as saying you have a specific form of breast cancer driven by a molecular pathway, a disease mechanism, specific to a much smaller set of people who have a certain mutation, for example, in a cancer cell. That opens up then the idea that you can look specifically at that disease mechanism, potentially develop therapies that would address that mechanism specifically, so that therapy would be available to a smaller set of people with breast cancer who exhibit that mutation. So that's the sort of change in paradigm that we're talking about when we're talking about precision medicine. And as we've said, that's driven entirely by a proliferation of discovery, of really being able to understand at a fundamental level what's going on with these disease pathways. And so to take that the quick next step forward, next generation sequencing, I just want to make sure that everyone in the room is kind of on the same place of understanding what we're talking about when we're talking about this technology, which has really opened up this field tremendously. And Joydeep, I wonder if you might just go back and explain what we talk about next generation sequencing. What was the generation before, and what specifically is this technology doing for the field of medicine?
Yeah, thanks. So without getting too technical, right, what was the paradigm before was that you would look at a specific gene, sometimes you were looking at a specific mutation, and therefore you had to know previously what genes you're going to go after, and you had to do this in a very sequential manner. So you had to guess which gene was mutated based on the type of cancer, and then search for that mutation. If you didn't find it, you would go to mutation number 2. Obviously, the issue with cancer is that it's not a disease of a single mutation. It is an accumulation of mutations over a long period of time, and often you're dealing with a disease that is not monoclonal, in the sense that there are many types of cancer that coexist in a patient, each with possibly different sets of mutations that are driving it. So the power of next-gen sequencing is that it can look at mutations in multiple genes and multiple mutations in multiple genes at the same time. So a single test now can give the patient an understanding, and their clinician, an understanding of what exactly are the different mutations present in the tumor, and therefore, from the point of view of precision medicine, the physician can then choose the right drug for, or right drugs for the patient with one single test. And this eliminates a lot of this trial and error that used to happen before, and still is if people are not using the power of NGS. And you got to think about this. The trial and error has two big consequences. Consequence number one is that it delays the patient from getting the right drug, and the delay is something that these patients often in stage 3B or stage 4, in the case of lung cancer, can ill afford, right? Their lifetime that they're looking at, survival, is often measured in months rather than years, and each test taking several weeks, and a regimen of therapy could take a month or more. So if you're on the wrong therapy in the beginning, your chances of survival at the end of the day are much reduced. Second, obviously, is the pain and the additional expense that the patient and the healthcare systems have to go through. And then the third aspect of things is, of course, that often multiple testing as a third, less talked about problem, is that you often run out of tissue to do the third level of tests. And this is a big problem because if you're running out of tissue, you cannot go back and take another biopsy from the patient because, again, these patients are extremely sick and often very compromised. And the whole process of extracting a tissue biopsy in many cases can cost tens of thousands of dollars, if not more. So NGS is really a way to get that answer to physicians and patients very quickly with one test, with small amounts of tumor tissue being required, and really changes the paradigm of treatment that these patients can receive.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Andrew.
I just wanted to comment on that. I think that's exactly right. But I think that you can't underestimate the issue of running out of tissue. You can't non-invasively biopsy a lung. You're either going through the side and puncturing somebody's lung or going down through their throat. It's a very, very invasive procedure, and it's often very difficult to come by. So if your mother, your sister, your brother were the patient, it's something to consider. So the fact that we now have the technology and the ability to test everything off of a very small biospecimen, rather than continually going back or running out of the specimen so that then the patient doesn't know what to do, I think is a huge advancement. And the other piece of it is we've been focusing on putting the patient on the right therapy and on the right time and all of that. It also prevents people from being put on the wrong treatment. And it prevents people from being put on a therapy that might not have any benefit for them and cost the system and the person hundreds of thousands of dollars. So I think that piece of it is something that we should not overlook as well. It's not just putting them on the right one, it's also not putting them on the wrong one.
Yeah, and Andrea, to add to that, right, there's the side effects of
Absolutely.
any one of these treatments, which are often pretty harmful.
Mm-hmm. Side effects and costs, et cetera.
Right.
Yeah.
Time wasted when you could have been doing something more effective.
And also clinical trials. Because
Yeah.
by testing all the mutations, you know what clinical trial to put a patient on.
Great. And I think it should be noted as well that these are technology advances not just for clinical application, but also in research itself. So these are tools that are fundamentally at the kind of the whole along this whole continuum. So that's a quick demonstration, I think, of a good explanation. I appreciate that, of the advances in technology that are enabling a wealth of information to be opened up with less patient impact ultimately, and ultimately at lower cost as well. So if we flip forward, Mark, you said something I thought was interesting, which seemed to me at least to call out potential tension. You said ensuring kind of safe, most effective tests that are approved as rapidly as possible, right? So the tension between safe and effective, but also fast or efficiently quick. Maybe we could just stay on that for a moment to touch a little bit more on the regulatory piece. And as some of you know, and just to make sure everyone's up to speed, there's kind of a long-running debate over the appropriate oversight role for FDA when it comes to tests that are developed by laboratories. And the reason that has arisen is because although FDA has what some argue, but most think, certainly the agency thinks it has statutory jurisdiction to oversee tests developed by anybody, whether it's a manufacturer or it's a laboratory specifically. FDA has exercised regulatory discretion in not requiring labs to bring their tests through FDA approval process. So labs have the ability under this current paradigm to develop tests on their own and perform them within their laboratory for patients a manufacturer who's developing a very similar test and distributing it for use has to go through an FDA approval process. So that's engendered, as you might imagine, significant debate over whether or not labs are getting the right level of oversight, and they do comply with a number of quality requirements and so forth under lab regulations. But let's just touch on that topic somewhat broadly, and if I could ask you to opine a little bit further on kind of what, not even necessarily what the right regulatory framework is, but just to talk a little more about what the comparatives are that maybe you all agree on in terms of assuring test performance. And, at the end of the day, should clinicians and patients have, what questions should they be able to ask or get answered when they're looking to use a new test and so forth? What are the outcomes we really want from a regulatory system as we look ahead to seeing that this field advances as quickly as possible? In no particular order, but
well, so as Andy stated, there is this bifurcated regulatory system in the United States where you have tests that go to FDA for review and approval, and then you have tests developed at, say, an academic research institute that's designed to be used in-house that are called laboratory developed tests, or LDTs, that don't go through FDA approval. However, there is lab oversight, I was mentioned, through CMS and CLIA and CAP proficiency tests. But these certifications or accreditations are of the lab and ensuring that the processes are right and accurate, but they don't really go to the test level to say whether the results of the test are comparable or similar to, say, a same-in-class diagnostic that was approved by the FDA. And so our standpoint is that all tests there should be some type of oversight to ensure that all tests are safe and accurate that are being provided to patients. And one mechanism to do that is by potentially all the stakeholders that are here at the table and that are in this field could adopt some minimum analytical standards that all tests should meet, and that FDA could approve as being some minimum bar. And so outside of just a formal FDA regulatory review, LDTs could just demonstrate that they meet these minimum standards. When a diagnostic test goes to the FDA for regulatory approval and it gets approved, FDA publishes the summary review, and so it's available for any physician to go to and be able to identify what the limitations and capabilities are of those tests. However, that's not true with LDTs, and so I think another key component here is transparency. And so I don't think you can accurately say that every LDT out there is not safe and effective, but the truth is we don't have a way to know that because the data or the tests that they go through to validate their tests aren't made publicly available, which is a disservice to physicians and patients because they don't have access to this data to know whether, or to be able to assess for themselves what the limitations and potentials are of these tests, to know which one to ask for, which I think gets into another issue, is that oftentimes physicians don't really know what tests are being used on their patients, whether it's an LDT test or an FDA.
So, I mean, I think that one of the things that's very difficult in this area is you have many different questions that you're looking at from a regulatory perspective. So primarily what Mark was talking about in terms of analytical validity, there are key questions on how do you know if you get a certain result that you do or you do not have a particular variant in a particular gene by one laboratory, that it's the same as the results you're getting from another laboratory. It is true that is the intent behind the laboratory regulation, but it's also true that regulation is not on a per test basis. It's periodic inspection, and it's going to depend upon how good inspectors are and whether or not they can pick up on certain problems. I think as you look across the different stakeholders, and as Andy said, this is an issue that's been going around for many, many years, and we've had lots of broad-based discussions with laboratories and manufacturers and patient groups and provider groups as well. And I think that everyone pretty much agrees that it is critically important that there be analytical validation standards that can be transparent and can be agreed to. It has taken a while in this particular area because for a lot of the period of time, there really haven't been proficiency testing materials in a lot of these areas, because depending upon the nature of the assay, you may have something that only one laboratory in the country is performing. As we get more and more, particularly in areas like next-gen sequencing, you're going to have more and more that you can have that type of assessment. Fortunately or unfortunately, it isn't necessarily just a question of FDA, because in many areas we have FDA oversight of diagnostics where there's been problems. Do a lot of work with diabetes testing supplies, and we have some systems that work very well and others that don't, that are all have been cleared by the FDA, and FDA themselves recognize that's a particular issue that they have, just as CLIA, CMS and the accreditors recognize that there can be some that are doing high quality laboratory testing and others that don't. So I think that we have a lot on the analytical validation side, but also what's also critically important is on the clinical validation side. And at the end of the day, with the diagnostic, what you are doing is providing information for physicians and patients to treat and make treatment decisions. And I think, and this is the internist in me, as a doc, you want to make the best decisions based upon the best available information. And sometimes that information is not perfect, but is the best available information, and you can deal with limitations on understanding what the clinical meaning of the information is, and that's really the clinical validation piece of it, assuming the underlying baseline of the analytical validation is right. And that's where I think that efforts to look at evolving standards and databases and pooling in the data commons so that there's a lot more pooling of information to understand what various biomarkers might mean, and particularly what they might mean in combination. And those are areas that I think both from a scientific perspective as well as from a regulatory perspective we really need to get right. And then a third area, and Mark had touched on this earlier, is modifications. This area is evolving very, very rapidly, and if every time you made a modification to a diagnostic that follows the PMA pathway, you have to go through a 180-day supplement, which is actually quite expensive, but even more importantly can be a time delay. Those updates won't be done. And so we've got to find ways to be able to do that can continue to assure that whatever the modification still will assure that the test is accurate and reliable, but at the same time isn't bogging down so that we have tens of thousands of laboratories having to make tens of thousands of submissions that would overwhelm the FDA. And that's still an area that I think we still have a lot of work to do from a regulatory policy perspective.
So maybe I'll just interject a very quick primer here on a few terms that Paul used and actually explained them, but I want to just make sure everyone's clear. When we think about diagnostics from a regulatory and a payment standpoint, there's really about three criteria or sort of benchmarks we look at. And the first is analytical validity that Paul referred to, and that's basically, does a test measure something in the way that it purports to? In other words, is that telling you whether something's there or not? Is it right that something's there or not? Or to what degree is something present? And that's analytical validity. And then the next piece we look at is clinical validity, and that means, is your test result actually relevant to decision making? So to use a facetious example, I could measure iron in your blood and come up with a number that's spot on, and then tell you, as a result of this measurement, you must have X cancer, right? Well, that's probably ridiculous, but that demonstrates that you could have a total disconnect between something that's accurate and whether it's reliable, in the sense that it actually is relevant to the disease for which it purports to be relevant. And then the third piece, which is not, those two pieces are within FDA's purview to make those determinations on a pre-market basis. And then the third piece that we talk about a lot as well is clinical utility, right? And that's that broader and somewhat harder question of to what extent does this test result, when used as intended, affect outcomes, and then all the things that are associated with differential outcomes, health economics and so forth. And that's, of course, what payers are looking at, and health systems and so forth, when they're determining whether or not to cover and pay for a test or to use a test in their system. They're hoping that it will be different, lead to different outcomes and different overall impact than a test they may have been using before. So I just wanted to quickly interject that as for a level setting as we go forward. But Joydeep, you want to talk a little more about regulatory aspects?
Yeah, let me, maybe I'll take the patient angle first, right? And I think, especially in the area of cancer, it's important to understand that both LDTs and IVD products are very essential, right? As Paul was mentioning, this field is moving incredibly fast. There is new mechanisms, new mutations that are driver mutations, and new treatments that are coming available every day. What that means is that for physicians to use these new findings from science, you need to have a path that gets them to a test relatively quickly that they can use in a lab to then, to treat a patient appropriately. Currently, the only way to do that is through a lab-developed test, because an FDA test, an IVD, takes several years and a substantial amount of investment before it goes through. So this path to innovation, this path to getting patients the benefits of new discoveries in science is absolutely best done through an LDT path. Now, I do not disagree with Mark and Paul that there could be improvements to the LDT process and how the oversight is provided to this. That definitely needs to continue, and I think it needs to be made more safe and more standardized. And some of the current practices actually prevent that from happening, right? So labs are actually prevented, and especially us as manufacturers are prevented from transferring any information, any best practices from one lab to another. While there are reasons for this, what also happens is every lab that comes up with a similar test has to go through the same trial and error and learning process, often making the same mistakes that the first lab made in coming up with that test. That clearly is not right, and moreover, it doesn't serve the patient right at all. I think from an IVD perspective, and just so that you know, coming up with an LDT is not a simple process, right? Most of the time it's come up with at large academic medical centers where you have PhDs and people that have the scientific and the technical background to be able to validate a test from scratch. The reality is that the majority of cancer patients do not go to academic medical centers. They go to community hospitals, and I think it's almost 80% of cancer patients are at these community centers which do not have the wherewithal to come up with their own LDTs. So clearly there is a need for FDA-approved tests that can be adopted at any lab with very little validation required. As I said, the current paradigm for an FDA-approved test is that it often takes multiple years and I would say several tens of millions of dollars for a single test to be moved through the FDA. So let that sink through for a second, right? You're not talking about $1 million and a quick one-year path. You're talking about 2 to 3 years with multiple tens of millions of dollars being spent in approval of the test. So first of all, that means that by the time an IVD for a particular indication gets to market, because of the pace of science, it is already 2 years behind the state of art. But it still does have the benefit that once there is an IVD, any lab with a CLIA/CAP certification in any corner of the country or the world that has this certification can be very quickly adopted and serve patients locally. So there's a case for both. I would say that you need better regulations that allow labs to be able to share best practice, and probably better controls need to be available for labs to be able to validate their LDTs across maybe a more common standard. On the other hand, FDA definitely needs to do more to shorten the time scale and the cost and the expense of that is required to get an IVD to market. And especially as Mark was pointing out, these tests, these panels like ours with the AdvaMedDx target test, they were initially approved for lung cancer and 3 particular drugs. Now, other genes, there are 46 different genes on the panel. The panel can easily be extended to other types of cancer and other types of tumors, but that extension is still a very arduous process today. Even though the panel has been approved and we've gone through about 225,000 pages of data submitted to the FDA for the first approval, it's still an arduous process to get the rest of the markers approved. And I think definitely the FDA can and should do something about reducing that burden of effort that is required before the test can get to more patients and more types of cancer.
Thank you, Jody. Andrea?
So I think that a lot of it has been said already, but just again to put it into perspective from the patient side, is the question is, what if we get it wrong? You know, and so I do think there needs to be a good compromise between the current situation of lab-developed tests versus overregulation by the FDA. But there is an in-between. Because the problem from a patient side is if you don't get it right and if these lab tests return bad results, then you're put on a therapy that's not beneficial to you, and it costs the system thousands of dollars, but more importantly, it costs you your life. But so I think that we need to keep that in mind as well as we're going about trying to figure out how to ensure that they are high quality, that they are returning the results that they should return without impeding innovation, because the science is moving so fast that we do need to ensure that there's also a rapid or more efficient approval system for getting these additional tests onto the market. So I think we just need to be able to balance those two things. And some of the current proposals that are out there, the DAIA has some issues, but I mean, overall, I think it's a good compromise. But there are, people have been working for many years towards this, but it's very important for all of us to recognize that we do need to ensure that we have safe, effective, transparent tests that return what they say they're going to. You know, everybody comes to us and to others to say, oh, you need to educate your patients to ask about the test, or you need to educate the doctors to ask about the test. I would argue that no, we don't. I think that we in this room should get it right so that we don't have to ask that question, so that a patient or a doctor in the community doesn't have to worry about whether their test that they're ordering is going to return a result that they can rely on. And that's what we have the opportunity to do.
Great. So we didn't come here today to resolve all these regulatory questions, but we all wanted to make sure that you came away with a bit of an understanding that there is an ongoing real debate, and it's really meaningful, right, for patients, for the industry as a whole, for manufacturers, for laboratories. The entire diagnostic system right now is looking towards Congress and the regulatory agencies to figure out whether or not there is a better resolution going forward to some of the tensions you've just heard about, right? And those tensions between speed of innovation, speed to patients, oversight, third-party assurance of quality, and so forth. And I just want to emphasize also, this is a complex dynamic field, right? We're talking about many different players developing a wide range of technologies, fast-moving, iterative technologies, lots of people developing similar types of tests. So if you're looking at it from a regulator standpoint, the challenges of just keeping up, even developing lists for transparency purposes of who's doing what out there in the field is really challenging. Look to further, a lot more discussion and debate on this going forward. I don't want to shortchange another couple of critical areas that we wanted to talk about a little bit, and that is particularly on the payment side. What's the payer perspective on all this, both in terms of Medicare policy and in more generally perhaps also for private payers? How are they wrestling with some of these very questions about what should I be covering and paying for? How do I figure this all out? That increasingly is a challenge as the science gets more complex, and then we get into these tests that are returning lots of information that people have to first wade through and figure out what's there. And I guess I'll turn to you first, Paul. You've been involved in this area for a very long time. You referenced earlier some of the changes that are coming about as a result of statutory action a few years ago. We're seeing CMS implement a new payment system for the diagnostics fee schedule, a purported update to the 1984 framework. Maybe you could dive in a little bit and just give us a quick recap of what's happening on the Medicare standpoint and tee up a couple topics we could talk about for a few minutes and on the payer side.
Sure. So from a reimbursement perspective, we're often thinking of kind of three buckets. Coverage, which is whether or not they'll pay for it, which is often an issue of do you have adequate science to get them to agree to pay for it. Payment rate, which is at what rate they'll pay for it, when they are going to pay for it, and then coding, which is kind of the language of how this gets forward to the payers. And there's been a lot of work in all three of those areas in the last decade or so, and a lot of it even accelerating recently, as Andy was referring. So from a coverage perspective, as I referenced earlier, I think one of the things that was challenging as we started to have diagnostics that were becoming visible because of their pricing to payers was just a knee-jerk response of needing two randomized controlled trials for safety and efficacy, and not actually even understanding what that meant from a diagnostic perspective, because with a diagnostic, really what you're talking about is having information to inform patient management. And so having enough information and enough accuracy and reliability in that information to help determine, can you make a decision, and is it likely or a reasonable possibility that you might change what you're doing. Give chemo, not give chemo, give a different chemo, give radiation, give a different dose of something, stop something if you're on it. All of those are relevant questions, and that all gets to what Andy was referring to as clinical utility. Not easy, though, to study, because if you think about it, when you first come out with a new marker, docs may not be sure exactly how to use it. They may not be at a level that they want to initially use that tool alone to make a treatment decision, so they may decide to use it along with other information. And as it moves from being adjunctive perhaps to being more definitive, and as you get more information, that takes additional research. Many times you can be out from FDA, or if you're a laboratory developed test, out even earlier, without a lot of that information. But if it's just a binary yes-no decision making, it may be that no one will be able to develop those kinds of data. One of the advances we had in the Medicare program was the creation of a program called the Molecular Diagnostics Program out of Palmetto GBA, one of the Medicare contractors, that now covers slightly more than half of the country in terms of its making coverage decisions. It's not perfect, has had a lot of bumps and growing pains along the way, but one of the things that's very positive about that program is really being able to sit down with the payer and say, here's the disease state, here's the data that we have, what would be relevant additional endpoints to ask? What are appropriate endpoints? And actually coming up with a pathway to cover it while you're still collecting those additional pieces of information. Got to have at least some evidence that it's accurate and reliable, have to have evidence of the clinical validity, and at least some idea about what's the utility hypothesis, but perhaps not the I had to wait 5 years before I said yes at all. Because to ask for laboratories and diagnostic companies that are not capitalized from a clinical research perspective, the same as large pharma companies are, to have pharma-like data at day one would not work. So that's one area, and that's still advancing and growing. Another is we had investments in diagnostics that were unheard of before. It used to be a couple $1 million, and less than a year was very common. Now we have diagnostics that are tens of millions of dollars, 50, even $100 million to develop those tests. Well, unless you have a reimbursement system that is going to provide adequate return on that capital investment, no one is going to make that investment. We don't have a good ability, really, though, to come up with value-based metrics. So one of the ideas was that private payers do, that laboratories and manufacturers can negotiate value-based decision-making for price setting on the private side, and could we then have Medicare reference that? And that became law in 2014. It was in the Protecting Access to Medicare Act of 2014, which we often refer to just as PAMA, but it was Section 216 in PAMA. That was intended to peg Medicare rates to private market rates. We just got the preliminary determinations based on labs reporting into Medicare of their private payer rates, and got some good news, some bad news. For a lot of the single laboratory tests that are advanced diagnostic tests, not surprisingly, just one laboratory reporting in, it had its whole market. The rates seem to be going well. Unfortunately, with distributed tests that are kits and looking across a broad range of tests, CMS unfortunately had a very narrow market that it asked to report in, and we seem to have an underrepresentative sampling in what they've done. So there's lots of concern and questions today about the implementation of PAMA and the representativeness of the data. But it, again, is a mixed bag, because the single lab tests they seem to have gotten right. It's almost everything that's multi-lab where we're having significant issues. The third piece is coding. One of the issues that we've had is you've got a lot of tests that may sound similar in terms of looking at related markers or even the same markers, but that doesn't mean that they're all the same. And so one of the mechanisms in PAMA when it was passed was to create a system to allow for more granular coding. So if you build a better mousetrap and it really performs better and you want to put your money where your mouth is, you can get your own code and could have a payment rate established around your own test. AMA came to the fore and developed a framework for that under the CPT coding system. That just started about a year ago, but seems to be going well in terms of being able to create the codes that are needed. Still, jury's out as to whether or not the payers are going to look at these kinds of codes and put them into the mainstream system. That's what they're intended to do, but it's still relatively early. So with coverage, payment, and coding, all of those areas, we have some new tools. We're hopeful that they will be able to meet some of the requirements in order to make sure that the value for these precision medicine tests is recognized, but still a lot of work to do to make sure that the implementation of all three of those works right.
All right, so you just got a mini tutorial from someone who knows as much about this field as anyone in DC or pretty much anywhere. So hope you appreciated that quick walkthrough. So I'd like to ask the rest of you to maybe comment very specifically on the extent to which you believe either payment uncertainty or low payment rates commensurate with value, non-commensurate with value, are inhibiting patient access or further developments in this field. Can you give us a quick take on the extent to which you think payment is sort of a critical factor here?
Yeah, I can go on this. I mean, we have these conversations with our customers very often, right? So I can tell you, without exception, the current reimbursement rates from CMS are absolutely slowing down or inhibiting the adoption of NGS by many labs. And I think there's two specific problems. So one, even for LDTs, the reimbursement rate at, I think it's just under $600 or about $600 for NGS tests for less than 50 genes. And that rate is often too low for any lab to make any profit, even if they were reimbursed 100% of the time, right? And here comes the second challenge, is there's no guarantee, which is, Paul, was your point about, when you take a vast spectrum of labs, you find all sorts of rates being there, and many of these labs are not getting paid for a year sometimes. And so it really impacts their cash flow and their profitability, and they want to think twice about adopting this test when they can generate much more profit with using single gene tests that are more readily reimbursed and are much more of a state and true course. It also then shuts down that path to rapid availability of innovative tests, which is the very thing that can really help patients, right? So I think the rate at which this is reimbursed is really needs a more careful study, and I don't think the path that PAMA is taking at this point, which is, let's look at what everybody else is reimbursing and peg it to whatever the market rate is. Because for this nascent market, there is no market in many cases, right? You can get it wrong with a lab offering something and saying, oh, that's the right price for the test, versus, a lot of people that unfortunately have not been able to get reimbursed, pushing the rates down. I think the second part of it is exactly that there doesn't yet seem to be a distinction, and we'll see when tests such as ours and some of our other colleagues in the industry get their tests approved. There has to be a differentiation between the rates at which IVD tests are reimbursed versus an LDT, because otherwise there is no point in doing an IVD test, right? You submit data over 2 years and to the extent of hundreds of thousands of pages, and if that expense of tens of millions of dollars is not recognized by CMS or payers, then the incentive to go down the path of IVD will really be taken away. So I think that jury is still out. We'll see what happens to that. But that distinction in saying that these IVDs are held to a higher standard and they really should be the gold standard has to be followed up by a better reimbursement profile for those particular tests.
One good example of how all these areas kind of interlock or could interlock together. Andrea?
So I think reimbursement absolutely has an impact. I mean, obviously it impacts the manufacturers in terms of their incentive to innovate, whether the IVD going through the FDA approval or not. But even more importantly, it has a huge impact on whether the doctors even order the test, which is access to the patient. Because if the doctor doesn't order the test, the patient never gets it. And even for single analyte tests, which have been around for many years, the adoption rate, just put in perspective, is only about 70 to 80% for drugs and for tests that have a very long history, EGFR, ALK, And even there, they're not. So now that we're moving to next-gen sequencing or multiplex PD-L1 testing for immunotherapy, which are these very innovative tests that can spare the patients, can return a lot of information. If they're not reimbursed adequately for people to innovate, but if they're not reimbursed to a point where a doctor is incentivized to order it, it's not going to happen, and the patients are going to suffer. And then really, at the end of the day, we're not going to benefit from precision medicine. I mean, as a nation, we've made this huge commitment to precision medicine, starting with the Human Genome Project, and invested billions of dollars in it. And we keep talking about precision medicine, and yet we overlook the very fundamental piece of the diagnostic, which unlocks the ability to benefit from it. So I think we do need to get this right, not just from a manufacturer innovator perspective, but from a patient access perspective as well.
Great. So ideally, we would now move on to the next 4 hours of our program. But since we've just about come to the
part one.
yeah, right. Part one, a quick introduction, quick
Stay
walk
tuned.
through this enormous field, right? So I thought what would be useful, and I apologize as well that we didn't really have a lot of time here for audience questions, but I expect some of our panelists could stay around for a few minutes and chat with you following. And so I thought maybe we would end, just to keep this on time, we would end simply by going down the table and asking each of you, if your diagnostics policies are, what's the one specific thing you would fix today that you think would make a really critical difference in this field?
Can I go last?
Someone else want to volunteer to go first before I pick on you?
It might be easier going first.
All right, Mark, go ahead.
I think just to summarize what I heard at this table and many of the discussions that we've had over the past few months, I think for me is just ensuring that the tests that are out there available to patients, regardless of whether it's FDA approved or an LDT test, are safe and accurate, and that there's appropriate oversight, and that this information's made available through a transparent process. And I think if those standards can be achieved and tests can demonstrate that they meet some level of performance metrics, I think that can go a long way of alleviating some of these downstream issues with reimbursement.
Yeah, I think there's lots of areas that I think for reform, but one, I think in particular, there are a lot of people doing a lot of parallel processing with respect to development of information that I think would be more effective and more efficient if it were pooled. Certainly there are attempts at doing that, but with many, many rare variants, you really need very large populations to understand what they mean. So the more we have efforts to pool into a data commons what different variants mean, and what, from a long-term basis, and what interventions those can inform, and what the outcomes are based upon those matched interventions, the better things will be overall. Having everyone replicate the same database, having every tech assessor for a payer review the same database seems really inefficient, and will break down as we get to just innumerable numbers of markers, and especially interrelationships among those markers.
Yeah, I would agree with Paul, right? Especially as you get with, in the area of precision medicine, data is king, right? And the more you balkanize and restrict data to just one lab or a set of labs, and do not use the power of multiple labs providing that data, the slower your progress is in this front. It does come down to still ensuring access, patient access to these technologies. And NGS is just one example, and I'm sure there'll be others in this field as well. But to ensure access, you do have to get two things right. One, as we've talked about, you have to allow innovation to proceed under the right controls, as this panel has discussed. And then, of course, then you have to ensure that people, labs, and manufacturers are incentivized, and doctors are incentivized to actually then prescribe and offer and prescribe those particular tests. And that goes back to the regulations that allow innovation, but also then the reimbursement that is commensurate and incentivizes people to then offer these tests in a democratized fashion.
All right, Andrew, it's fitting you have the last word, but you've also raised our expectations.
No pressure.
Right.
But no, I think that actually what everybody said summarizes today very nicely. But I have to agree with Mark in terms of the very basic fundamental thing. If we have to be able to ensure that tests are returning the right results. If we're able to do that, then we'll be sure that the data that comes from them can be shared, and that then we know that how they should be reimbursed for access purposes. But fundamentally, I think as a first step, it all comes down to ensuring that the tests are doing what they say they're going to do, and that we have a regulatory environment that's able to control for that without over-controlling to inhibit innovation.
Great. Well, I want to thank you all for expertly walking us through a tremendously wide set of topics and doing it really well. And thank all of you for joining us, and please join me in thanking our panelists.